Hi, everybody. Welcome to our Friday night event here with Your Vitality Project. I'm Bob Weathers, and this is my dear friend, Angela MacLeod.
Hi, Bob.
It's good to have you with us, Angela, and especially with this topic tonight. We've been summarizing kind of a review in the last several posts of different influential streams that help to nourish and feed Your Vitality Project. And so we've talked about my background in clinical psychology, excuse me, for sure. These are the ill effects of talking all day. So it's a little bit worn out tonight. So we talk about the influence of clinical psychology, looking at, for example, developmental psychology, psychological research on addiction, education, addiction and recovery, those kinds of resources. Excuse me. We also talked about the whole literature in and around mindfulness, and so mindfulness practice and mindfulness research. And then the last piece was looking at the influence of the psychology of Carl Jung, who draws together a lot of different strands, not the least of which includes looking at clinical applications of therapy, for example, and weaving that in with spirituality. And then we tied that explicitly into his involvement in the early days of what served as the foundation for AA with Bill Wilson et al. And so what I did for today, which is kind of a summarizing post, was to tie together what we had just looked at for the last several posts in Carl Jung, and really with a wish to integrate the other influences to clinical psychology more broadly, mindfulness approaches more specifically, and tie those into a cartography, kind of like a way of checking in with ourselves to kind of assess how we're doing across these dimensions. These 5 dimensions identified certainly aren't exhaustive. There are ones that I didn't mention, but they cover a lot of the pie. And I like to think maybe they cover 80% of the pie, something like that. And so it's well worth our having something in hand. And I think that the language, the actual terminology, can be adapted to whatever one is comfortable with. I'll quickly summarize those 5 dimensions that we're talking about: a holistic daily inventory, something that we can track each day. You know that I do this in the mornings. I just track this very organically. It's not hard or painful work. It's just a way to kind of keep on track with myself. And I'll mention the terms and just define them very briefly with the full awareness that somebody else might have a different terminology. You probably have a different terminology, Angela, and I'm completely supportive of that. I think we have to find what works for us. So the first dimension that we tied in, I'll just speak of this in regards to Carl Jung. He was very interested in our being embodied creatures. So he's very interested in the earth being embodied and wrote a lot about that. So he was one of these psychologists that paid a lot of attention to our being earthly creations. He has beautiful passages that address that. And so one dimension is to look at how am I doing in my body as a foundation for everything else. That's the first one. The second one is looking at, he was very interested in, he was a lifelong scholar, and he was really interested in pushing our leading edges into new areas. You just shared information with me today, and I responded to you looking at this really burgeoning application of nervous system regulation, the theory and the research that people like Stephen Porges have done, and really excited about that concept we talked about earlier today. That'd be an example of our stimulating and developing our minds, and that's really how Jung understood that, would be really intellectual cognitive development. We've talked about Ken Wilber, who's the founder of integral theory. He puts a lot of stock on that intellectual line. He feels like the cognitive or the intellectual line kind of carries all the other ones: moral, emotional, developmental. And I think he can say that because he's such a brain, but there's probably some truth to that too. So, so body and mind. The third one is my own term for this. I've put a great deal of store in with my work with my clients and in my own personal life, and I know you have too, in terms of cultivating creativity. And so I like to think of that as somewhere midway between the mind and the spirit. And I thought about this way for years. And so I call that soul. and that's an idiosyncratic usage. There'd be plenty of people that would use a different term for that, but I like putting the soul right in between there. It feels like it's equal parts kind of mind and body and spiritual and other energies. So when I think of soul, so body, mind, soul, I think of how am I doing in terms of expressing myself via whatever creative forms I've been given. You're a dancer, I'm a drummer. That's an example of it, but it could be multiple avenues of expressing our creativity. The fourth dimension that we summarized I call spirit, and that one's not new, and that's very much linked into Jung's focus on spirituality. I should have mentioned Jung was one of those psychological theorists that had a lot of interest in the arts and creativity, so I've been very drawn to him because of that. And certainly he was very interested in spirituality and in a very broad and inclusive sense. I love that he was a student of the various world wisdom traditions and invited those of us that want to continue to develop to ourselves be open. And so how am I doing spiritually in terms of cultivating spiritual resources that really matter to me in my life? So, and then the fifth one is kind of specifically Jungian. This is actually the language came from Jung, and it's been picked up in our culture, this idea of the shadow, which would be all those parts of myself that I just do not look at and maybe sometimes have a hard time even discovering. And so he developed, as have those in that tradition, have developed skillful means for uncovering the personal shadow in our lives. And it's what Freud would have called the personal unconscious, but Jung meant it kind of more specifically, and that it is accessible with practice. And so I have a book right here on my bookshelf, I'm going to pull it off here, by Robert Johnson, the Jungian analyst, just called Owning Your Own Shadow. And there are tons of resources out there for doing shadow work, and how am I doing with that? And so I think that, for example, journaling, if it's honest and transparent, can be very useful. I do that. I know you do too. I think being involved in self-help support groups where invitations to share vulnerably and again honestly, I think that's a huge asset. You and I have both been very engaged in a number of different groups that support that. So there's different ways of working that, both individually and corporately. So there it is: body, mind, soul, spirit, shadow. So that's a quick review of kind of dimensions of ourselves that we might look at. They all interpenetrate, but it's worth our kind of establishing how we're doing with those and seeing which ones we seem to be nourishing, on a daily basis, and maybe some that for whatever reason we may be neglecting or missing, and that we can maybe re-accentuate those. So I want to offer that as an introduction. And Angela, I'd love to just see what your thoughts are about this, and any suggestions or experiences you've had would be welcome.
Okay. That was great. That was a great overview and summary. And I'm right with you on that whole mapping and allowing that to be a supportive way of kind of tracking different aspects of life, different dimensions. And as you know, I was introduced to this sort of holistic or integral perspective as well a few years ago when I got sober. And that really was so helpful for me. I love visuals, so having a visual chart helped me rather than just a checklist. And I created more of like a wheel with each of these dimensions, like a spoke on the wheel. And at that point, I wasn't thinking very clearly in early recovery, and I just was overwhelmed a lot. And I got a hold of John Dupuy's book, Integral Recovery. And so that became a kind of a map for me. You're grabbing that book.
Sorry. Here it is, right here.
There it is. Yeah.
It's gonna be funky here because of the. Let's see. Let's try this. See, can you see this? I gotta get it right. The camera.
I can't read it, but there it is. There you go.
There it is. That's the title of the book. I'll tell you, I'm using a green screen, and John's book is green, and so the whole book disappears.
Okay. Right.
John, we love you, and this book is called Integral Recovery. John Dupuy is Dupuy. It's easily accessible on Amazon, so highly recommend it. Please continue. Please continue.
Yeah. Well, at that point, it was very helpful for me to just like commit to every day doing an inventory using this map. And so on my map were the things you just mentioned that you listed. And I included other things as well, because there were other areas I needed to look at. My work situation, my home situation. I need to kind of look at my environment, my relationships. And so this whole idea of, you know, surrendering to, you know, a format in the early stages was really helpful for me. And it was also revealing to me how without the map, I could think I'm covering everything. But if I'd really sit down and kind of methodically look at each aspect, how am I doing in the area of creativity? You know, like you were bringing up, because that is really important to me, and that's actually been one of the most healing aspects of my recovery journey is connecting with my creative self. In fact, I don't know if I would have a robust recovery without that. And even though it sounds like a luxury, but for me, it is actually a very healing part. And more recently, the shadow dimension has been really up for me, partly from your posts, but because it is still in my wheel of, you know, what I look at in my day-to-day life, my own inventory. And sometimes, well, I want to say how mindfulness actually really dovetails well with this idea of the inventory, because at least for me, when I get quiet, when I get into a quiet space, and I tune in, and it's almost like I'm just asking my body, my soul, you know, what's up, what's happening. So I don't always use mindfulness just to completely, you know, clear everything. I actually invite what is happening, what's real right now, and bring mindfulness to that. And then I can't do that anymore without, if something I've been kind of pushing aside or I haven't been looking at, it'll come right into this, right in front of my face. You know, okay, this issue isn't working out well, so it's time to look at this. And for me lately, it's been the topic I brought up this morning when we chatted, which has been recognizing how I will try to please or appease people out of fear of them being upset with me. So it's really scary to me if somebody's angry or upset with me. And so I'm kind of hyper vigilant, and a lot of times not even aware that I'll say yes to something that I don't really want to do if I think somebody's going to be upset with me. And so for me, that's maybe an example of a shadow aspect where there's this automatic pattern that's running me, you know, and that that I'm not completely aware of until I start becoming aware of it, and then there's the work to do with that. So that's really up for me right now.
Yeah, it's a beautiful example of it. It's looking at these parts of ourselves that sometimes are hidden to us. Maybe it comes up, maybe somebody else gives us feedback about it, or we run into some kind of impasse, dead end in our lives, and we realize there's something going on here. And then if we can begin to dig into that, just like you're talking about with this piece of pleasing others or appeasing others, and explore that, it can really we can really transform these blockages in our lives. And that's the payoff of it, is if we do the hard work of digging down deeply in that dirt, we can find something, we can find gold. We can really find transformation. I really credit you. I love our sharing it like we did today, because it sets in motion. So I come across an article this afternoon that's related to this topic. You send me a link to a educational series, and so on it goes. Is that it's a wonderful synergy. And you and I have this community, and then we're a part of the Vitality Project groups and that community. And also other communities, is that if we can create kind of a momentum or a synergy, you can actually, I really like hanging out with people like you, Angela, who are doing this kind of work. I really enjoy that kind of honesty, that kind of vulnerability. that kind of optimism, which is, you know, I'm really wanting to change my life and live in more and more integrity and so on. I love being with people like you. So it really, it's nourishing personally, but it's also becomes part of what I seek interpersonally as well. It's one of the missing pieces, and I get it. You and I are both very quadrant model coming out of integral theory. This 5-part model is pretty much what that model would call upper left-hand quadrant, with a little bit of right-hand quadrant, upper right-hand. But I'm very aware that it's missing the societal dimensions, the systemic dimensions, like you mentioned, work, school, the election coming up, all of that, as well as our relationships. It's not that those are unimportant. These are almost more, it's almost like a more personal inventory. What am I doing inside of myself? And then I really do want to track with you, how is that manifesting in my closest relationships, and how is this affecting favorably, ideally, my ability to work and contribute in the world? All of that's very important as well.
Yeah, I think you did actually bring in the relationship level, because you mentioned, you know, being in support groups, or not just support groups, but interpersonal situations where you feel safe enough to really be yourself, bring your shadow work into the relationship, so that this is another part of it for me, is that just being alone with my own process is super important to me, to have that, create space for that. But that's not enough by itself. It's like I need the relational aspect in my life as well, to be heard, to be seen, understood, and give that to other people. Because there's unknown things that happen for me when I'm in that relational mode with this stuff. I can't do that by myself, that other part that happens in between people, and spirit or God or whoever, you know. So there's a breadth to it that is really important to me.
Thank you. You make me think of something, Angela, too. Is for the next week or two, I have a series of posts that I'm writing. The theme is, I've had to kind of come up with a terminology that works for me. I'm calling it deactivating the victim. And I have in my mind the victim in quotes, because I really think it's possible for us to be victimized. And you and I have spoken enough that we've experienced. I don't in any way want to diminish the reality of victimization. I put it in quotes because I mean there's a way that we can turn that into a role or an identity, and that's how I mean it. And I really want to work, and I picked the term deactivating. I want to reduce its power in our lives. And so I'm working on that right now, the next couple of weeks. But right beyond that, the next series that I'm really looking forward to doing, and you and I will be talking into this, is I really want to look at the relational dimension. We've been looking at mind-body bridging, and I want to bring in mind-body bridging in terms of how it manifests, how it can actually assist us in relationships, moving through ruptures, etc. And so I really do want to bring in more of the relational dimension. You and I both know Ian through the Vitality Project. In fact, Ian may be listening to us tomorrow as we speak. Ian is in Australia, you guys. And so it's morning time for Ian tomorrow. Let's see, tomorrow, I was just talking to somebody else from Australia today. They're celebrating Halloween today. Ian is equally invested in the relational dimension, as you know, and so very interested in drawing on your interest in relationship and connection and dialogue, communication, and Ian's in this next piece. I really want to see the Vitality Project, among other things, begin articulating more fully the relational dimension of recovery, and how absolutely vital it is, it seems like to me, to a full life. And I'll hold off on that. I kind of point in that direction on Wednesday night with Michael, is that I have some real rubs with traditional self-help programs. One that I didn't mention is sometimes the kind of divide and conquer approach. Like, you go work on yourself, I'll go work on myself. Let's clean up our sides of the street. And I think that's vital. I think that's vital. I also think that's really partial, because I think you can do that and come back together And I really think that a relationship is greater than the sum of its parts. If you don't work on the relationship as relationship, you can have your side of the street cleared out pretty doggone well and still go sideways in a relationship. So I want to address that more full on here, and that's a longer term commitment. So we'll come to that for sure. We're almost out of time. We're almost out of time tonight, and I want to invite any final comments for you. I'd like to give the last word to you tonight.
I'm not coming up with a whole lot. I think this is really fantastic. One thing that stood out from our conversation earlier for me that was really helpful was, and then this is actually what I also got from the 12-step program, you know, what's your motivation? And so that inquiry of asking what's your motivation in so many different areas of life, you know, even in a given moment, in a relational mode or what we're doing, is to tune in, what is my motivation? And so back to that topic earlier with appease, when I please people, that's been helpful for me to look at what is my motivation, because sometimes I want to give. It's not just that I'm afraid of their reaction, so I'm going to do whatever they want me to do. But I have a generous energy. I want to give to them, you know. So being able to tune in, and this whole thing about inventory, when you get into a practice of inventorying regularly, then you can tune in more easily. You know, what is your motivation? Is this coming from my shadow, just a reflex that isn't really beneficial to anybody? Or is this a part of my true nature, you know, that I'm doing this action or giving something in relationship?
Thank you. Thank you for that. I really concur with you. You mentioned earlier that when you just kind of open a space in your mindfulness practice, what needs to be addressed will rise up organically. And I really want to say this in arm in arm with you, Angela, to encourage anybody who's embarking on this kind of practice. And we've talked about it today in terms of a holistic daily inventory. You'll adapt and modify this, whoever's listening, to your own whatever suits you. But I really feel the same way as you, is with practice, we can get this where there's a very nuanced self-awareness. I did not grow up self-aware at all. And I have painful reminders of that across my life. But with daily practice, there's much more attunement to what's going on inside. So like you were saying, if it's something coming up inside that needs to be addressed, it comes up. If you need to examine your motivations, is this coming out of a pure motivation, or is this distorted by some kind of shadow material or whatever like that? Just to have that awareness is such a gift. And I really do think that practicing this, I don't think this, I think both you and I know this, is that with practice, you do develop this kind of finesse with your inner world that can really serve in relationships, in the work that we do, and in our own peace of mind. So really would love to invite others to consider some daily practice to begin to tune into yourself, and you'll be amazed at the results, how quickly they come, and how transformative they are. I really, I'm right with you. Angela, thank you. Thank you so much for your participation tonight. I love our conversation through the day. This is a wonderful arc on Fridays for us. Really good. I'd love to invite anybody who's listening that has any hankering at all. Angela and I are very engaged in the Vitality Project. We have group meetings on Tuesday and Wednesday evenings. They're at 5 o'clock Pacific time. And this kind of conversation we're having is not atypical for what happens in that group. It's a small group. It's a lot of people who are really seeking this kind of insight and awareness and healing, and really invite anybody who has a hankering for this to join us. I also invite any of you that care to find out more about Angela's multiple gifts and knowledge in multiple areas, whether it's Qigong, movement, nervous system regulation, nonviolent communication, mindfulness. We can just go down the list. To contact Angela and or me through the Vitality Project. You can reach us, and I'd love to connect you with Angela if anybody who's interested. So for sure, consider a big invitation to all, okay?
Great. Thank you.
All righty. Have a wonderful evening, wonderful weekend.
Too.
Happy Halloween to you, my dear. Okay.
Happy Halloween.
Take care, Angela. Thank you. Good night.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.